I'm really looking forward to it. As Vani said in the kickoff and the setup for this, really would like to encourage a dialogue. And I know in this format it's a little bit different because we can't do it real time. But if you do have questions or stories or examples of the topic that we're talking about, certainly invite you to type those in, and Vani will get those routed to me so that we can include those in our discussion today. The purpose in these webinars is really to enhance our thinking and our learning as practitioners and as executives in topical areas around how organizations can compete and how they work effectively. And so you can see from today's topic, we're really going to dive into the issue of how to take advantage of virtual networked organizations. And probably the first question is, well, what are we talking about here when we talk about a virtual networked organization? So let me start with a definition, just so that we're on the same page from a topical perspective, and then I'll get into some of the other intro pieces. But in my view, when we think about a virtual networked organization, we're talking about the idea that unlike a very traditional organization that has a very strict structure and hierarchy to it, more and more organizations are finding ways, particularly using technology, to work across organizational boundaries. And therefore, even though a reporting relationship might stack up through an organization in a traditional way, the way the organization is actually working is in a much more virtual, networked fashion, where people are working across boundaries in ways to get certain work done or to make certain decisions that maybe are non-traditional in the way that the organization is formally set up. So that's kind of the essence of what we're talking about, and we'll go into that in a lot more depth here as we get rolling. Now, for those of you who are new to these webinars, let me give a little bit of background as to who I am and what AlignOrg Solutions is and what we do. We're a niche consulting firm, and we specialize in the area of doing strategy and marketplace positioning. We help organizations diagnose and assess their current capabilities to deliver against their strategies. We do organization design work, change management, and implementation. And then we help get leaders aligned around the strategy and the way their organization is supposed to work. And for those that are familiar with our work are probably aware that we do most of our work side by side with our clients, where we're in the trenches with them using our methodologies and tools and helping them to think about how they're going to differentiate and win in their marketplace and work through these different aspects I just mentioned. The other part of what we do is we do capability building, which this webinar today is a part of. The capability building we do are with human resource professionals, with other folks that deal in organization transformation topics for their organization, and also, of course, with executives as they think about how to lead and guide their organizations to a competitive advantage. Now, whether I share stories from all of these organizations today or not, these are organizations that we hear about a lot in the press, that we read about, we know, we are familiar with, and so forth. And what we find is that they're great stories that come from learning from other organizations. And so to the extent possible, we'll be sharing some of the stories, may not be again from all of these particular organizations, but the idea is that as we learn from these stories, we can hopefully take away principles and ideas that will help us improve in our respective organizations and deliver what we're trying to do. So with that set up, I'm going to dive in now to the topic at hand. And there's really three primary topics or dimensions that we want to explore today, which I'm calling the keys to successful virtual networked organizations. The first one is when virtual works and when you really have to get face-to-face. The second topic is defining the decision model. And the third is clarifying roles, responsibilities, and expectations. And most of these, just on the surface, might seem pretty ordinary or pedestrian, But if you've worked in an organization that has struggled to get things done, particularly across organizational boundaries, you'll realize that a lot of the time the root cause of those issues fall into one of these particular areas. Now, before we go too much further, let me start with a story. A few months ago, I was engaged to work with a high-tech firm that specialized in developing different types of collaboration software and solutions. And we'll leave it broad like that. And what was interesting is they had reached out after they'd spent the course of maybe 2 to 3 months internally working through an organization redesign for a part of their business. And to their credit, they did the entire thing virtually. Their organization is spread around the world, and they have all these fantastic tools that they can use in the cybersphere, if you will. And they did the entire design that way. So they'd schedule times, they would come together, they'd work on shared documents, they would track the project using virtual means. I mean, in some respects, it was a glimpse into the future. And as I heard the story, I thought to myself, wow, what a great example. I wonder what I could learn in terms of how we could apply the same techniques in the work that we do. And then as I started to probe a little deeper, I started to ask questions. Well, how did it go? What were the results? How did people feel about it? Those kind of things. And interestingly, what I started to hear was, well, it took a long time. It wasn't really clear where we were going or how we were going to get there. It wasn't really clear who had the decision rights and how the decision ultimately got made. And it really actually sort of felt clunky. I don't know if that was their word per se, but that was basically the feedback. And it caused me to wonder, well, here we are at the fringe of the frontier of working in a collaborative virtual way across an organization to drive a substantial strategic initiative about how the business would be set up to compete. And the response is we weren't clear, it took too long, and it felt clunky. And I thought, wow, if this is the future, that may not be exactly what we're looking for. So let's try to peel back a little bit and understand some foundational principles that can help us operate and make decisions in a more effective way. So these are the topics we're going to cover today. And for those that are familiar, the next couple of topics that I'm going to touch on are going to be ones that are tried and true, but I do want to set a foundation for our discussion. In our book, Mastering the Cube, we've introduced this notion that an organization is like a Rubik's Cube. A Rubik's Cube is a complex puzzle that has to be solved by manipulating the different sides of the cube until all the colors are appropriately placed on the respective sides. And in some respects, the action of moving those small, rectangles all over the cube is not too dissimilar from how we have to align the work, the structure, the information and metrics, the people and rewards, the continuous improvement, the leadership and culture aspects of our organizations. As soon as we set up a work process to work a certain way, that has a talent impact. And so side A impacts side D. And that's why the Rubik's Cube for us is such a powerful metaphor, because the better you can get your whole organization lined up to driving what you want, the better the outcome. So I want you to kind of hold this thought, because this is the idea upon which our entire discussion today is going to be based. A networked virtual organization is a combination of choices that have been made in all of these 6 dimensions that, if not well aligned, might lead to long decision-making times, poor clarity on who's to make the decision, and a feeling that it's clunky because things are not well aligned. Now, if we dive into this further, for those that aren't familiar with the analogy or another design model, each dimension or side of the cube has questions that it prompts. For example, the work side prompts the question, how should processes be aligned to deliver value? What tools and technologies will enable performance? And if we keep going around the cube, these questions, and there's countless questions, but these are some basic ones. For instance, what structure and linkages will enable delivery? Or how can we measure for both quality, delivery, and efficiency? What talent is needed, and how do we incent performance? How can we continue to deliver value and return that to the business? And then what culture is going to enable successful performance? And again, these are just some of the basic questions. But if you think about the virtual networked organization that I described a few minutes ago, and if you think about the example I gave of the company that I had the chance to work with that worked through a design process in a virtual way, you can see very quickly that there's potentially sides of the cube that were not well aligned. Now, if we had a 2 or 4 hour session, we might take each of these dimensions and explore them in depth as it pertains to how we think about a virtual networked organization. But we're going to keep it simple, and we're going to focus on a couple of the critical principles and areas where we have seen some organizations trip up. So the first topic that I really wanted to dive into in some depth is this idea of when does virtual work and when do you still have to get face-to-face? And the reason that I think this is an important topic is because I think there's still a question happening in a lot of our minds out there as technology in particular continues to advance, is it almost seems like, well, if the technology can enable us to do it virtually, we obviously should do it virtually. And I'm worried that if we continue down that logic or that line of thinking, what will happen over time is we will continue to do things in a virtual way when virtual may or may not be the best way to do something. So the way that we started to think about this is to look at the different types of work and determine whether or not different collaboration methods work or apply differently with the kind of work that you're trying to do. So for example, one body of work that we do is sharing and gathering information. And you can probably think in your organization of all sorts of things. Some of that can be done very effectively in a virtual way. Other times, it's a little more challenging to do that. But some of the questions that it prompts is the information something that can be shared verbally, or are there different aids needed? Can the information be gathered and categorized and verbally, or are frameworks required? So those are just two questions. There's many other questions. For example, are there clearly defined fields that can be populated, or is the response and the data a little bit more asymmetrical and it has to fill in sort of open response and it's a little more difficult to analyze and to make sense of? So those are some of the questions.